Welcome back, friends, to Tiny Town Trains TV. T4 here. It's time for this week's installment of My Favorite Railroads. This is where I talk about one of the railroads that will have a spot on the 9-level high layout build. You see, in addition to a featured railroad, one of the things that can make a layout more interesting is having your railroad interact with other railroads. This time, we're looking at the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. The AT&SF, often referred to simply as the Santa Fe, was first chartered by the Kansas Territorial Legislature back in 1859 as the Atchison and Topeka Railway to connect Atchison, Kansas to the newly established state capital of Topeka, Kansas. The railway built through southwest Kansas and reached the Kansas-Colorado border in 1873 and then Pueblo, Colorado by 1876. It wasn't until 4 years later, in 1863, that Santa Fe was actually even added to the name. But ironically, the railroad's main line never reached there as the terrain was too difficult, and the railroad chose to bypass Santa Fe altogether to lay tracks instead to the nearby city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. As the railway was first being built, many of the tracks were laid directly over the old wagon ruts of the Santa Fe Trail, and in 1869, the first general office building of the company was built in Topeka, Kansas. Like the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, or Katy Railroad, the major business in the early days was shipping cattle. Now, the Denver and Rio Grande Railway, or D&RG, and the Santa Fe had both surveyed a path through the same series of canyons and passes in several areas of Colorado and New Mexico, and the race was on. During this time, the two railroads had a series of skirmishes over track-laying rights, which resulted in 2 years of armed conflict that became known as the Railroad Wars. The feud continued until the federal government intervened and a settlement was reached in 1880. The D&RG, later called the D&RGW, won the path through the Royal Gorge, but lost the bigger prize to the Santa Fe, which was the route south into New Mexico and an easier build toward the west coast. As a result of this victory, in 1881, the Santa Fe connected with the Southern Pacific Railway at Deming, New Mexico, forming the second transcontinental rail route, 12 years after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad back in 1869. Now, the Santa Fe built its own lines in Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, but its lines in Missouri, Illinois, Texas, Arizona, and into California were gained almost entirely through acquisition of smaller railroads and then piecing them together. The Santa Fe was able to grow more quickly by taking control of several smaller but significant railways from Wichita, Kansas to Fort Worth, Texas, and from Kansas City to Chicago, and lines to Amarillo, Texas, and to Denver, Colorado. While they already owned railroad lines inside California, the Santa Fe Railway still couldn't reach California on its own railroad tracks, and they really wanted to break the Southern Pacific's monopoly on the southern west coast. Then, in 1897, the Santa Fe traded its highly prized railroad properties that it owned in the country of Mexico to the Southern Pacific for the SP's branch line between Needles and Barstow, California. This was the last piece of the puzzle, and the Santa Fe wasted little time connecting to both ends and upgrading it as their new Pacific Coast main line. AT&SF purchased even more lines in California beginning in 1906, including access to the city of Los Angeles, and by 1912, the railroad had attained the nearly 10,000-mile route map it would operate from the 1920s through the 1950s and beyond. On the 9-level high layout, Santa Fe trains will appear coming and going from Kansas City on the Parade of Railroads. If you enjoyed this video, hopefully you'll come to your senses, but if not, then like and subscribe, because everybody needs to let off a little steam now and then, and there's no smoke fluid required. Till next time, keep your train on the tracks, and I'll see you round the next bend. Take care now. T4 out.